very early on in this process of thinking about the project and thinking about the scientists and the kind of work that went on or goes on in these buildings. I was most fascinated by trying to make the building, in some ways, a kind of equivalent to the cultural life inside that building, more so than addressing necessarily the technical concerns or the more bureaucratic concerns that are also part of the work that they do. And in doing that, we started to talk in the design of the building about a series of different, in a sense, thematic directions that would begin to characterize other qualities of the building, other qualities of the experience that we wanted the scientists to have in the building. And in developing those, first by thinking about what those were, and then beginning to develop those, many of the models were made to quite literally represent or investigate or speculate on those specific ideas. Often those were more abstract, conceptual ideas or themes. And to try to create an equivalent to those qualities in the model meant that, in many ways, each of those models, every time we approached one of those questions, the model, we had framed the question in such a way that the models were made in different ways to try to get more specifically at those questions, to be more precise, to be more focused about those questions. Along with that, there were many models that were built that are probably more homogeneous almost in at least what they look like. And those tended to be models that were really looking at the massing of the building, how it related to the site, many of the more pragmatic concerns of the building in that larger campus. But I think many of the models that you see in the show today are these other models that are much more interested in the conceptual basis of the project. And I think in that way, taken as a whole, as opposed to any one model individually, it begins to hopefully add up and give you a much more clear, much more comprehensive story of what the experience of being in that building might actually be like.
So even the way they are displayed, in a way, when you are in this position, you could see them, and it's sort of like seeing the same person photographed from
a number of different directions,
right? A number of different directions, or a number of different photographers.
Yeah, maybe even
one is focusing on.
Right. Even maybe
one is like
at different times during their itineraries during the day. That there is a certain amount of, in these models, I think, speculation about even the psychology of the scientists at any given moment, which is probably changing over the course of the day, the week, as they're trying to engage that very complex set of ideas. Not again so much technically, but this idea of looking and thinking about and characterizing planets, distance, travel, scale, that are unlike any of those characteristics really on Earth, or at least there's a very difficult way of making an equivalent. And I think that space that they occupy, we've talked about this being the space of the mind in many ways, is something that the models, any one individual model, I think doesn't quite represent. And in a way, I think it is the same character rendered through the full arc of what their experiences might be, what their state of mind is at any given moment.
Can we talk a little bit about how the design occurs in your office? Is there some old-fashioned drawing that goes on, an old-fashioned model making where people cut and paste? How much of it is computer controlled, computer designed, computer milled? And when do you decide which you're doing?
It's really a blend. It's really a mix, a hybrid of all of those qualities. And for me, it's not so much about the techniques. In fact, it's not about the techniques so much. Some of these models are fabricated completely as digital models. Some of them are cut. For instance, the structural model is cut as on a laser cutter using digital files, and then that gets assembled by hand to give it its three-dimensional qualities. I think we move in the office and in the process fairly elastically between these different techniques, really depending on which thing is going to get us to that representation in as complete and full a way, to try to get as much, to find a way of making the model that presents a model eventually that the model relates to what it is that we're trying to get at. I've found though that I often use the models. There are models in the process that are in some ways kind of terminal models. They're models that are meant to represent completely one idea. They're at the end of an investigation. But then there are models that are part of the ongoing process. And in that way, the design process in my office is an extremely three-dimensional one, physically three-dimensional. And the model, whether it's a digital model or a handmade model, a new-fashioned or an old-fashioned model, is really driving, it really characterizes the design process and the investigations. What I've found is that very often we're able to move the design forward quickly with a lot of energy by making the models, in a sense, in a hand-built way. That there's a wood shop, and we use a lot of plastic tools as well. And those, in a lot of ways, I think are also, we're not showing as many of those in this exhibition, but there are hundreds of those, and they're really not so much, they're not a terminal model, they're not the end of the process, they're a step in the process. They're an indication of where the design is going. They're a kind of adolescent snapshot of what the building, what the project might actually look like.
I'm especially interested in the vulnerability of three of the models, the two that are brass structures with heavy blocks on them, and then the wonderful layers of acrylic. The two brass models, was there, specifically the one with the gypsum cement, was there a reason for using gypsum cement? Was it just the look? It seemed like the ultimate challenge to the model.
To make it as difficult to ship as possible.
To make it the most fragile, solid, white, easily markable, breakable material, and then mounted on a sort of bouncy structure.
Well, that model was really investigating these, they're really semi-public spaces or public spaces, shared spaces in the building. They're meant to be, those spaces that they represent, that the white, the plaster represents, are most times outdoors. They're unconditioned spaces. They're within the envelope of the surface of the building, but they're not conditioned spaces. They're really outside. Some of them, there are a few of them that are inside, but they're all equivalent in a way in terms of how they add to the internal life of the building and the culture of the headquarters building. Those volumes in the actual building are open, in many ways very light, and are a little bit ephemeral. But their importance for the building is significant. In some ways, I think they're the most important spaces in the building that we're designing, because it's the place where there's the ability for a collision of ideas to take place as different scientists have meetings, run into each other. They are the town square, or a series of town squares in this building, the equivalent to that. And I was trying to get the importance, the kind of density of what would happen there to be represented in some way in the model. I didn't want it to be transparent. I didn't want it to be ephemeral. I didn't want it to feel like those were spaces that could disappear somehow. So I started to think about making them as very heavy volumes. And in contrast to some of the other models, which are more machined, or more precise, or more tooled, I like the idea that those spaces, given their character, would be much more, they'd be rougher, that they would be more touchable, that they would feel, in a sense, almost more hand-built, that you would see the mistakes and the imperfections and the difficulty of casting those and casting them cleanly. That the textures in those blocks were important as well. And the brass as an armature was not so much about the brass, but the lightness was trying to just define the geometries of the volume of the building. I've always been fascinated by a number of very early Giacometti pieces from his Surrealist period. And in many of those, there are these cage-like armatures with these very heavy volumes that are in deeply psychological relationships to each other, I think. And I think those models were very much in my mind at the time. And consequently, in the exhibition, it's one of the models that personally, I like thinking about in relationship to Pauly's work, and some of the making of both the things he made earlier and then in the Zeno part of the exhibition.
And then what about the acrylic model that's made of acrylic sheets, which is just the opposite of this,
Right,
in that
right.
it's so solid, and yet it looks absolutely ethereal.
Right. That was a model. That model is in many ways about connections, about this web of connections that are created between those volumes I was talking about, as well as between the office culture of the building as a whole, which tends to be much more cellular and individual, isolated, and a little bit discrete. Each of those offices, one from the other. And that web of connection partially comes out of what we were able to do in terms of breaking down the typical vertical circulations and cores in the building that you generally have that characterize an office building. And being able to do that structurally and through the design process, broadcasting those connections more thoroughly through the entire building. It's a little bit like chutes and ladders in the entire building. So there are a number of
if you put a marble down in one spot,
Right.
it would make its way through.
That's right. That's right. And in the design of the project, we continued to talk about and test out these different itineraries. What would happen if someone was there and they needed to get there? Which way would they go? That person, how would they go? Would they, in fact, intersect with each other at certain moments? And in doing that, there were drawings in the beginning that were more web-like drawings that felt more like diagrams of air travel or information networks. But I wanted to try to use the things that we were actually working with, stairs, the elevators, those cores. But to do it in a way where there was a greater level of equivalency between those forms and the whole of the building. So it is. The image is a bit fugitive. Depending on where you are and you walk around the building, those stairs appear and disappear and emerge again. The topographies of them, I think, become clear only from certain angles. And that sense of, it's not disorientation, but that sense of multiple opportunities to move through and around and connect to the building. And the way that they both become very present and fade into your experience in the building was the launching pad for that model. It was actually, that model was the most difficult, I think, of all of the models. It was the most complex because we were trying to take something that was so normative, something that you've seen a million times before, stairs and elevator cores, and give you more the sense of the experience of how they relate to the entire internal space of the project.
And how did you realize it physically? Did you use a computer to determine some kind of calculations which would translate into a machine?
Well, in the original, as we were designing the project, originally there were a number of again these very stick-like diagrams that just said, okay, you're going from there to there, literally creating a point, a series of lines and nodes in the building. What was interesting in thinking about that model and that idea was that a lot of office buildings are completely isolated, floor by floor by floor. And making a vertical urbanism inside of a building, especially an office building, is something that has been very much in my mind in this project, in the way that urbanism or a public space of interaction is not just at the ground floor, is not just at the lobby or an important meeting room in the building, but again is really broadcast thoroughly through the building. And in a way, that layering up and down there relates to some of the topographies on the site and places that the exterior mountainside that the building is on connects to. So this building connects at the ground floor, a first floor, a second floor, and a third floor. And that's a significant thing, that it's not a building that has a ground floor lobby and then a base, a middle, and a top. In a sense, it is, again, a more three-dimensional object. We started thinking about that model as a kind of topography, that you would cut it in the same way that you would cut a topography model. And it's not just those, the stairs and the elevators, the vertical circulation, but in that model there are also the tracings of the corridors, the pathways, the offices, those outside spaces. And so I was interested in if you built a model up in that way, as opposed to a topographic model, which very often it's the exterior form that's important. Here, could you begin to build up the interior form that produces a very similar experience?
And this is my last question, as objects that are right now in a museum, do you feel that there are things that you would like to be preserved in the condition that they're in, that they should remain pristine? You talked about the white surface being touchable, but of course, people touch it. The surface can be molded. So how do you feel about those issues?
I don't know. I think it is a complicated issue. I think in some way I feel a little bit agnostic about it. That these models they're not meant to be models that are put in a vitrine, if they are, fine, but that's not really where they live. I think these models really lived from and live in a continuity of a process of design in which finally the real effect, whether all of these decisions and ideas and thinking are successful or not, get played out in the physical space of the building ultimately. So in that sense, they are models that are that are a part of this overall process, have been worked on, have been touched, cut apart, recombined, rethought, cleaned up, and all of that has happened in many cases, many different times. There are many iterations. You know, I prefer not to see the models destroyed, but the fact that they have some patina of life on them doesn't bother me so much. It's interesting. Models, as I mentioned, are very important to me and this process. And I've often thought about the relationship between the building and models. And I've always liked the moment, actually, when the buildings get built, not only because the buildings get built, but because, in a sense, I think it releases the models from their obligations to represent the ideas. Because at that point, the building actually artifact takes over. And it's the models, it's in the projects where it didn't get built, that the models I always find troubling. They're in a kind of, they're a state of arrested development. They have to carry all of that baggage of those ideas. And so part of my ambivalence right now is that the building hasn't been built yet. These still represent that in-between state. But ultimately, I both hope that the building does happen soon, and that these models at that point don't carry that kind of baggage, and don't have to be thought about from a preservation standpoint in such concerned terms, that they can still somehow participate in a life of ideas. And if that meant that they were handled, that wouldn't bother me.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting to know. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michael.
You're welcome.
I think we have a good insight.